In a world where military protocol governs every breath and medals define worth, what happens when a single moment of unexpected revelation transforms not just one life, but an entire army's understanding of courage? Some stories begin with explosions. Others with love letters or declarations of war. This one begins with silence, the kind that falls over a crowd when they witness something so unexpected, so profound, that words become inadequate. It's the silence that preceded the moment when General Marcus Wellington, a man who had commanded respect across 3 continents, found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about strength, sacrifice, and the true meaning of service. What could possibly be etched into human skin that would stop a decorated war hero in his tracks? What image could carry such power that it would reshape military tradition and challenge the very foundations of honor itself? This is the story of Captain Elena Rodriguez, whose back bore more than scars from battle. It carried a truth so powerful that when revealed, it would ripple through the ranks like thunder across a valley. A truth that would prove that sometimes the greatest acts of bravery happen not on battlefields, but in the quiet moments when we choose to carry others' pain as our own. What you're about to discover will challenge everything you think you know about heroes, sacrifice, and the invisible battles fought by those who serve. Because sometimes, the most profound courage isn't found in the medals on a chest, but in the stories written on the skin beneath the uniform. The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Henderson as Captain Elena Rodriguez straightened her dress uniform for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. Her reflection in the small mirror showed a woman whose dark eyes held secrets deeper than the ocean, though her expression remained as composed as still water. Today was different from other inspection days. Today, General Marcus Wellington himself would be reviewing the troops, and Elena knew that everything she had worked for hung in the balance. Elena had earned her captain's bars through grit and determination that impressed even the most skeptical senior officers. At 28, she commanded respect from soldiers twice her age, men who had initially questioned whether a woman could lead them through the complexities of modern warfare. But Elena had proved herself time and again, first in training exercises that pushed physical and mental limits, then in real combat situations where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death for her unit. The tattoo across her back had been her secret for 7 years now. Hidden beneath regulation uniforms and careful positioning during mandatory medical exams, it remained unseen by her fellow soldiers. Only Elena knew the weight it carried, the story it told, and the reason she bore it with a mixture of pride and pain that no one else could understand. She had learned to sleep on her side, to change clothes in private corners of the barracks, and to deflect questions about her reluctance to participate in certain recreational activities that might expose her carefully guarded secret. General Wellington arrived at Fort Henderson with a reputation that preceded him like thunder before lightning. His military career spanned 35 years and included tours of duty on every major continent. He had been decorated for valor more times than most soldiers could count, and his strategic brilliance had prevented conflicts that could have escalated into international disasters. But, beyond his professional accomplishments, Wellington was known for his ability to see potential in soldiers that others might overlook, and his commitment to understanding the human element of military service that textbooks could never fully capture. As the general's convoy approached the main gate, Elena felt the familiar tightness in her chest that accompanied moments of high stakes. She had faced enemy fire with less anxiety than what she felt now, knowing that this inspection could determine her future in the military. Her unit had been recommended for a special assignment that would take them to regions where few women had served in combat roles, and Elena desperately wanted to prove that gender had nothing to do with capability or courage under pressure. The morning inspection proceeded with military precision. General Wellington moved through the ranks with an experienced eye, noting small details that revealed larger truths about discipline, training, and unit cohesion. Elena watched from her position as he questioned several soldiers, his manner serious but not intimidating. She could see why men and women under his command spoke of him with such genuine respect. There was something in his bearing that suggested he understood the weight that each soldier carried, both visible and invisible. When the general reached Elena's position, she snapped to attention with the crispness that had become second nature after years of service. Wellington's gaze was direct but not harsh as he reviewed her uniform and bearing. For a moment, Elena thought the inspection would pass without incident, just another successful review that would bring her closer to the assignment she desperately wanted. Captain Rodriguez, Wellington said, his voice carrying easily in the morning air. I've heard impressive reports about your leadership during the recent training exercises in Colorado. Thank you, sir, Elena replied, maintaining perfect military posture despite the way her heart rate had increased. My unit performed exceptionally well under challenging conditions. Wellington nodded, clearly pleased with her response. I understand you're being considered for the Patterson assignment. That's not a position that comes with guarantees or safety nets. Elena met his gaze directly. I understand the risks, sir. My unit is prepared for whatever challenges we might face. The general studied her for a long moment, and Elena sensed that he was evaluating something beyond her words or her military record. There was a quality in his attention that suggested he was looking for something specific, though Elena couldn't identify what that might be. She had faced this kind of scrutiny before, usually from officers who wanted to test her resolve or find reasons to question her capabilities based on assumptions about female soldiers in combat roles. The Patterson assignment requires complete trust between unit members, Wellington continued. There can be no secrets, no hidden agendas, nothing that might compromise mission effectiveness or unit safety. Every member of the team must be completely transparent about anything that might affect their performance or judgment. Elena felt a chill run down her spine, though she maintained her composed expression. The general's words seemed to carry a weight beyond their surface meaning, as if he somehow knew about the secret she had guarded so carefully. But that was impossible. Her medical records were clean, her background checks had revealed nothing problematic, and no one at Fort Henderson knew about the tattoo that covered most of her back. The inspection continued, but Elena noticed that General Wellington's attention returned to her several times throughout the morning. During weapons review, during the unit demonstration exercises, during the final formation before he addressed the assembled troops, she caught him watching her with the kind of focused attention that made her increasingly uncomfortable. She began to wonder if somehow her secret had been discovered, if there were military intelligence resources that had uncovered information she thought was safely buried. As the formal inspection concluded, Wellington announced that he would be conducting individual interviews with certain personnel who were being considered for special assignments. Elena's name was among the 8 soldiers called for these private sessions, and she felt her anxiety spike despite her efforts to remain calm. She had participated in many interviews throughout her military career, but none had felt as potentially consequential as this one promised to be. The interviews were scheduled throughout the afternoon in the base commander's private office, a space that Elena had entered only a few times during her service at Fort Henderson. The room was furnished simply but comfortably, with military memorabilia and photographs that spoke to decades of service and sacrifice. As Elena waited for her appointment time, she tried to prepare for questions about her background, her motivation for military service, and her plans for the future. When her turn finally came, Elena entered the office to find General Wellington seated behind the desk, reviewing a file that she assumed contained her complete military record. He gestured for her to take a seat across from him, and Elena settled into the chair with the same careful attention to posture and bearing that had been drilled into her since basic training. Captain Rodriguez, Wellington began, closing the file and giving her his complete attention. Your record is impressive by any standard. Excellent performance ratings, strong leadership abilities, commendations for courage under fire. You've clearly found your calling in military service. Thank you, sir. I believe strongly in the mission and the values that guide our service. Wellington nodded, but Elena sensed that he was building towards something specific. The Patterson assignment will require soldiers who can adapt to situations that standard training doesn't necessarily prepare us for. Cultural sensitivity, psychological resilience, and the ability to make difficult decisions with limited information. Do you feel prepared for those challenges? Elena considered her response carefully. I believe my experience has prepared me well, sir. I've served in diverse environments and worked with local populations in ways that required flexibility and judgment. And, personally? Wellington's question seemed to probe deeper than professional qualifications. Are there any aspects of your background or experience that might affect your ability to serve effectively in that capacity? The question hung in the air like smoke, and Elena felt the weight of 7 years' worth of secrets pressing against her consciousness. She knew that military service required honesty and transparency, but she also knew that revealing her secret could end her career and destroy everything she had worked to build. The tattoo on her back was connected to a part of her life that predated her military service, a time when she had made choices that she couldn't unmake and carried responsibilities that she couldn't abandon. "No, sir," Elena replied, hoping her voice sounded more confident than she felt. "I have no personal issues that would interfere with my military duties." Wellington studied her for a moment longer, and Elena had the uncomfortable feeling that he could see through her careful facade. But, instead of pressing further, he shifted the conversation to technical questions about her unit's training and her assessment of their readiness for challenging assignments. The remainder of the interview proceeded professionally, covering topics that Elena felt comfortable discussing without reservation. As the session concluded, General Wellington stood and moved to the window overlooking the parade grounds. "Captain Rodriguez, I want you to understand something about the nature of trust in military service. Real trust isn't built on the absence of secrets or difficulties in our past. It's built on the confidence that when those secrets or difficulties become relevant to our mission or our fellow soldiers, we'll have the courage to address them honestly." Elena felt her mouth go dry, but she managed to respond. "I understand, sir." "Good," Wellington said, turning back to face her. "Because tomorrow morning, I'll be conducting a final evaluation exercise with all the candidates for the Patterson assignment. It will test not just your professional capabilities, but your judgment about what aspects of your personal experience might be relevant to your service and your fellow soldiers." As Elena left the office, she felt as if the ground beneath her feet had shifted slightly. The general's words suggested that he might know more about her secret than she had believed possible, and tomorrow's evaluation sounded like it might create a situation where her carefully maintained privacy could be compromised. She spent the evening wondering how much the military knew about the tattoo she had kept hidden for so long, and whether her future in the service depended on revealing a truth she had never intended to share. The night passed slowly, filled with restless dreams and moments of waking anxiety about what the morning might bring. Elena had faced enemy combatants with less trepidation than she felt about the upcoming evaluation, because battles against external enemies were simpler than the internal struggle between her desire to serve and her need to protect the secret that defined so much of who she had become. Dawn broke over Fort Henderson with the kind of crisp clarity that promised a day of significant events. Elena had barely slept, spending most of the night staring at the ceiling and trying to anticipate what General Wellington's evaluation exercise might entail. She had participated in countless training scenarios throughout her military career, but none had felt as laden with potential consequences as whatever awaited her this morning. The 8 candidates for the Patterson assignment assembled at the training facility at precisely 0600 hours. Elena recognized most of her fellow candidates, all experienced soldiers with strong records and reputations for competence under pressure. Staff Sergeant Mike Chen had served 3 tours overseas and was known for his tactical brilliance. Lieutenant Sarah Morrison had distinguished herself in intelligence operations that remained classified. Captain James Hendricks had earned his rank through a combination of leadership skills and technical expertise that made him invaluable in complex operations. General Wellington arrived accompanied by several senior officers whose presence suggested that this evaluation carried more weight than Elena had initially understood. The general's bearing was serious but not grim as he addressed the assembled candidates, his voice carrying easily in the morning air without seeming forced or theatrical. "Today's exercise will test your ability to function as a unit under conditions that simulate the challenges you'll face in the Patterson assignment," Wellington began. "You'll be given a scenario that requires not just individual competence, but collective problem-solving, cultural sensitivity, and the kind of judgment that can't be taught from manuals or textbooks." Elena felt her anxiety increase as Wellington continued his briefing. The exercise would involve a simulated humanitarian mission in a region where military presence was tolerated but not welcomed, requiring the candidates to balance security concerns with the need to build trust among local populations. Teams would be evaluated on their ability to adapt to unexpected complications, their communication skills, and their decision-making process under pressure. One additional element, Wellington added, his gaze sweeping across the candidates in a way that seemed to linger on Elena for a moment longer than the others. This exercise will include scenarios that test your willingness to be vulnerable and transparent with your fellow soldiers when personal background becomes relevant to mission success. Elena's stomach tightened at these words, though she maintained her professional composure. The general's emphasis on vulnerability and transparency felt like a direct reference to their conversation the previous day, and she began to suspect that the exercise had been designed specifically to create situations where her secret might become relevant to the mission. The candidates were divided into 2 teams of 4, with Elena assigned to work alongside Chen Morrison and a communications specialist named Corporal David Kim. Their mission briefing described a scenario in which they were providing security and logistical support for a medical team treating refugees in a region where cultural tensions ran high and trust between military personnel and civilians was fragile at best. The exercise began in a section of the training facility that had been modified to simulate an urban environment in a war-torn region. The attention to detail was impressive, with buildings that showed realistic damage, civilian role-players who spoke with authentic accents, and environmental challenges that reflected the conditions they might actually face in such an assignment. Elena's team approached their initial objectives with the kind of coordinated efficiency that came from years of training and experience. They established a secure perimeter around the medical facility, initiated contact with local leaders, and began the delicate process of building relationships that would allow the humanitarian mission to proceed effectively. But, as the morning progressed, the exercise introduced complications that pushed the candidates beyond standard operating procedures. Civilian role players presented cultural concerns that required sensitivity and understanding rather than military authority. Equipment failures forced improvisation and creative problem-solving. Most challenging of all, the scenario included personal dilemmas that tested the candidates' willingness to share information about their own backgrounds when it became relevant to mission effectiveness. The turning point came when Elena's team encountered a group of refugee women who refused to accept medical treatment from the male medics assigned to the mission. The cultural barriers were complex and deeply rooted, involving religious concerns, past traumatic experiences with military personnel, and suspicion about the motives behind the humanitarian assistance being offered. Elena found herself in the position of trying to negotiate a solution that would respect the women's concerns while ensuring they received necessary medical care. The role-playing refugees spoke through interpreters about their fear and mistrust, describing experiences that had taught them to be wary of military personnel regardless of their stated intentions. As Elena worked to build trust with the refugee women, one of the role-players began speaking in rapid, emotional phrases that the interpreter translated as questions about Elena's own background and experiences. The woman wanted to know if Elena understood what it meant to carry invisible scars, if she knew what it felt like to have experiences that couldn't be easily shared or explained to others. Elena realized that this was the moment General Wellington had been building toward. The exercise had created a scenario where her personal background might be directly relevant to mission success, where her ability to connect with the refugee women could depend on her willingness to share something about her own experiences with carrying secrets and hidden pain. Staff Sergeant Chen watched with professional interest as Elena hesitated, clearly recognizing that this was more than a standard training scenario. Lieutenant Morrison and Corporal Kim also sensed the weight of the moment, understanding that Elena was facing a decision that went beyond tactical considerations to touch something more personal and, potentially more significant. Elena looked at the faces of the refugee women, seeing in their expressions a familiar mixture of fear, hope, and defensive wariness that she recognized from her own mirror during the darkest periods of her past. She thought about the tattoo that covered her back, the story it told, and the reason she had chosen to carry that particular burden in a way that would remain with her for the rest of her life. "I need to share something with my team," Elena said to the interpreter, her voice steady despite the way her heart was racing. "Something about my own experience that might help these women understand that we're here to help, not to cause more harm." Chen stepped closer, his expression serious but supportive. "What do you need, Captain?" Elena took a deep breath, knowing that once she spoke, there would be no way to take back the words or return to the privacy she had maintained for 7 years. "I have a tattoo on my back. It covers scars from an attack that happened before I joined the military. The tattoo tells the story of someone I couldn't save, someone whose death taught me about the weight of responsibility and the price of failure." Morrison's expression showed understanding rather than surprise, as if she had suspected that Elena carried some kind of invisible burden. Kim nodded with the kind of respectful attention that military personnel showed when fellow soldiers shared something significant about their personal experiences. The tattoo shows the names and dates of 12 children who died in a school shooting in my hometown, Elena continued, her voice remaining steady through years of practice at controlling her emotions when discussing this topic. I was a teacher then, and I was supposed to protect them. I survived because I was in the hallway when the shooting started, but I couldn't get back to my classroom in time to help my students. Chen's expression showed the kind of professional empathy that experienced soldiers developed when dealing with trauma and loss. That's why you joined the military? It's why I do everything I do, Elena replied. The tattoo reminds me every day that protection means being willing to put yourself between danger and the people who depend on you. It reminds me that courage isn't about being unafraid. It's about carrying fear and responsibility and choosing to act anyway. Elena turned back to the interpreter and asked him to explain to the refugee women that she understood something about carrying invisible scars, about surviving experiences that changed everything about how you saw the world and your place in it. She wanted them to know that the medical team wasn't there to judge or to pry into their experiences, but to offer care without demanding explanations or forcing trust that hadn't been earned. The response was immediate and profound. The refugee women began speaking more openly, asking questions about the medical procedures being offered and expressing concerns that could be addressed rather than fears that seemed insurmountable. 2 of the women agreed to accept treatment, and others began asking about family members who might also need medical attention. Elena's team worked for the remainder of the exercise with a new level of coordination and understanding. Chen, Morrison, and Kim had seen their team leader demonstrate the kind of vulnerability and strength that couldn't be taught in military manuals, and their respect for her leadership had deepened rather than diminished. They understood now that Elena's dedication to protecting others came from personal experience with failure and loss, and that her commitment to her soldiers was rooted in something more substantial than career ambition or professional obligation. General Wellington observed the exercise from a position that allowed him to monitor all the teams simultaneously. Elena noticed him watching during the crucial moment when she had chosen to share her story, and she wondered what he made of her decision to reveal information she had kept private for so long. His expression gave nothing away, but she sensed that this was exactly the kind of test he had designed the exercise to provide. As the scenario concluded, Wellington gathered all the candidates for a debriefing session that would determine who would be selected for the Patterson assignment. Elena felt a mixture of relief and apprehension, knowing that she had made the choice to be transparent about her background, but uncertain about how that transparency would affect her future in military service. The debriefing took place in a conference room where the candidates could discuss their experiences and the lessons they had learned during the exercise. Wellington led the discussion with questions that encouraged reflection about the relationship between personal experience and professional effectiveness, the role of trust in military units, and the ways that individual backgrounds could become assets rather than liabilities in certain types of assignments. Elena found herself speaking more openly than she had in any previous military evaluation, discussing the ways that her experience as a teacher had shaped her approach to leadership and her understanding of responsibility. She talked about the tattoo not as something shameful or problematic, but as a reminder of the stakes involved in decisions that affected other people's safety and well-being. The other candidates responded with the kind of respectful attention that Elena had hoped for but hadn't dared to expect. Chen shared his own story about joining the military after losing a brother in a conflict that might have been prevented with better intelligence and planning. Morrison talked about growing up in a family where military service was both tradition and calling, but also burden and sacrifice that affected every aspect of life. As the debriefing session concluded, General Wellington announced that he would be making final decisions about the Patterson assignment selections within 24 hours. Elena left the conference room feeling emotionally drained but also oddly relieved, as if a weight she had carried for years had shifted position if not disappeared entirely. That evening, Elena sat in her quarters thinking about the day's events and what they might mean for her future. She had revealed her most closely guarded secret, not because she had been forced to, but because the mission had required it and her fellow soldiers had deserved to understand the source of her motivation and commitment. For the first time in 7 years, Elena felt as if she had honored the memory of her students not by hiding their story, but by using it to help others. 24 hours after the evaluation exercise, Elena received orders to report to General Wellington's temporary office at Fort Henderson. The message was brief and formal, giving no indication of whether she had been selected for the Patterson assignment or if there were other matters that required discussion. Elena had spent the intervening time in a state of careful uncertainty, maintaining her regular duties while wondering how her decision to reveal her secret might have affected her military future. The office was the same room where their initial interview had taken place, but the atmosphere felt different now. Wellington's demeanor seemed less formal than it had been during the evaluation process, though Elena couldn't determine whether this change was positive or concerning. She entered the room with the same attention to military protocol that had become second nature over years of service, but she felt an underlying tension that hadn't been present during their previous conversation. "Captain Rodriguez," Wellington began, gesturing for her to take a seat. "I want to discuss yesterday's exercise and what it revealed about your background and your approach to military service." Elena settled into the chair, maintaining proper posture while preparing herself for whatever direction the conversation might take. "Yes, sir." Wellington opened a file that Elena assumed contained notes from the evaluation exercise, but, instead of consulting the documents, he closed it again and gave her his complete attention. "Your decision to share personal information during the refugee scenario was appropriate and effective. It demonstrated the kind of judgment and adaptability that the Patterson assignment requires." Elena felt a measure of relief, though she sensed that Wellington was building towards something more significant than simple praise for her performance during the exercise. "Thank you, sir. I believed that transparency was necessary for mission effectiveness." "Indeed," Wellington agreed. "But I want to discuss something that goes beyond yesterday's exercise. I want to talk about the tattoo you mentioned and what it represents in terms of your military service." Elena's anxiety spiked, though she maintained her composed expression. "Sir?" Wellington stood and moved to the window, looking out at the parade grounds where soldiers were conducting their morning training routines. "Captain Rodriguez, I've been aware of your background since before I arrived at Fort Henderson. Not the details, but enough to understand that you joined the military carrying significant personal experiences that shaped your motivation and your approach to service." Elena felt her world shift slightly, as if the ground beneath her feet had proven less stable than she had believed. "Sir, I'm not sure I understand." "Military intelligence includes resources that most soldiers never encounter directly," Wellington explained, turning back to face her. "When someone with your background applies for certain types of assignments, particularly those involving work with civilian populations who have experienced trauma, we conduct additional research to ensure that personal history aligns with professional capabilities rather than conflicting with them." Elena realized that her secret hadn't been as secret as she had believed, at least not from military intelligence services that had resources and motivation to investigate beyond standard background checks. "How long have you known?" Wellington returned to his seat, his expression serious but not hostile. "About the school shooting and your experience as a teacher?" "We've known since you applied for captain's rank 2 years ago." "About the tattoo specifically?" "That information came to light during the security clearance process for the Patterson assignment." Elena felt a complex mixture of emotions: embarrassment at having believed her secret was safe, relief that she no longer had to hide it, and concern about what this knowledge might mean for her career. "I wasn't trying to conceal relevant information, sir. I just didn't believe that my previous experience was directly related to my military service." "On the contrary," Wellington said, his tone becoming more emphatic. "Your experience as a teacher during a crisis situation is exactly the kind of background that makes you valuable for certain types of assignments. Your understanding of trauma, your experience with protection and evacuation procedures, your ability to remain calm while making decisions that affect other people's safety, these are capabilities that came from your civilian experience, not your military training." Elena had never considered her teaching background as a military asset, thinking of it instead as a painful chapter that she had left behind when she enlisted. "I'm not sure I understand how those experiences make me more qualified for military service." Wellington pulled out a different file, this one containing what appeared to be detailed mission parameters and personnel requirements. "The Patterson assignment involves providing security and support for educational initiatives in regions where schools have been targets of violence. Teachers and students in these areas have experienced exactly the kind of trauma that you lived through. Your personal understanding of that experience, combined with your military training, makes you uniquely qualified to connect with and protect people who might not trust standard military personnel. Elena felt her understanding of her own career and capabilities shifting as Wellington explained the assignment in greater detail. She had thought of her teaching experience and her military service as separate phases of her life, but the general was describing them as complementary skills that together created capabilities that neither background could provide alone. The tattoo, Wellington continued, tells a story that people who have experienced similar trauma will recognize and respect. It's not something to hide or be ashamed of. It's evidence of your commitment to carrying the weight of responsibility and learning from experiences that might have broken someone else. Elena thought about the 12 names and dates that covered her back, each one representing a student whose life had been cut short by violence that she had been unable to prevent. She had chosen the tattoo as a form of private memorial and personal reminder, never imagining that it might become relevant to her professional capabilities or her value as a soldier. "Sir, may I ask how you learned about the specific details of the tattoo?" Wellington's expression suggested that he understood the significance of her question. "Medical records from your entrance physical mentioned scarring consistent with previous injury, but didn't provide details. The tattoo information came from a different source, someone who served with you during your first deployment and observed it during a medical emergency when you were unconscious and required treatment." Elena remembered the incident Wellington was referring to, a training accident during her second year of service that had required emergency medical care. She had been unconscious when the medics cut away her uniform to treat injuries, and she had worried afterward about whether anyone had seen the tattoo. Apparently her concerns had been justified, though the consequences were different from what she had feared. The soldier who reported this information, Wellington continued, didn't view it as problematic or concerning. Quite the opposite. He described it as evidence of someone who had experienced loss and chosen to honor it rather than being broken by it. His report was part of what brought you to my attention as a candidate for this assignment. Elena felt tears threatening for the first time in years, though she maintained military bearing through years of practice at controlling her emotions during difficult conversations. The idea that her carefully guarded secret had been seen not as a liability but as evidence of strength and commitment was almost too much to process. "Captain Rodriguez," Wellington said, his tone becoming more personal than professional, "I want you to understand something about the nature of military service that they don't teach in training manuals. The best soldiers aren't those who have never experienced failure or loss. They're the ones who have learned from those experiences and chosen to dedicate themselves to preventing similar losses for others." Elena nodded, finding her voice despite the emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. "Yes, sir. Your tattoo represents 12 children whose deaths taught you about the weight of responsibility and the importance of preparation, vigilance, and decisive action. Those lessons make you a better soldier, not a damaged one. They give you understanding and motivation that can't be taught or simulated." Wellington opened another file, this one containing what appeared to be assignment orders and mission details. "I'm offering you the Patterson assignment, Captain Rodriguez. Not despite your background as a teacher and survivor of school violence, but because of it. The mission requires someone who understands trauma, who can connect with people who have experienced similar losses, and who has personal motivation to ensure that protection and security measures are effective rather than merely procedural." Elena looked at the assignment papers, seeing her name listed as team leader for a mission that would take her and her selected unit to regions where schools and educational facilities needed protection from violence that threatened both teachers and students. The irony wasn't lost on her that her military career had brought her full circle to protecting the same type of environment where she had experienced her greatest failure. "Sir, I accept the assignment," Elena said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what Wellington was offering her. "But I have questions about how my background should be handled with regard to my unit and the people we'll be protecting." Wellington nodded approvingly. "Good questions. Your background will be shared with your unit members before deployment, but only the relevant details about your experience and capabilities. The full story is yours to share or not share as you see fit." As for the people you'll be protecting, they'll know that you're someone who understands their experience and is committed to preventing similar tragedies. Elena thought about her students from 7 years ago, wondering what they would think about the way their deaths had ultimately led to her ability to protect other children in similar circumstances. She hoped they would approve of the way their memory had been honored through her choice to dedicate her life to service and protection. "There's one more thing," Wellington added, his tone becoming even more serious. "This assignment will require you to be completely honest with your unit about your motivations and your background. The kind of trust necessary for this mission can't exist if team members are wondering about hidden agendas or personal secrets." Elena understood what Wellington was asking of her. He wanted her to approach this assignment with the same transparency she had shown during the evaluation exercise, trusting her fellow soldiers with the full truth about her experiences and the reason she had chosen military service. "I understand, sir. My team deserves to know who I am and why this mission matters to me." Wellington smiled for the first time during their conversation, his expression showing satisfaction with Elena's response. "Excellent. Your unit briefing is scheduled for next week, and deployment will begin 30 days from now. Use that time to prepare yourself mentally and emotionally for what will likely be the most challenging assignment of your military career." As Elena left Wellington's office, she felt as if everything about her understanding of her own life had shifted. The secret she had guarded so carefully had become the foundation for her most important assignment. The tattoo she had hidden for 7 years would now be part of her professional identity. Most significantly, the students she had failed to protect would now be honored through her efforts to protect others facing similar dangers. Walking across the parade grounds toward her quarters, Elena touched the spot between her shoulder blades where the tattoo began, feeling for the first time in years that carrying her students' memory was not just personal burden but professional purpose. The conference room at Fort Henderson had been configured for a classified briefing, with security protocols that indicated the serious nature of what was about to be discussed. Elena arrived 30 minutes early, wanting time to prepare herself mentally for what would be the most personally revealing presentation of her military career. She had spent the past week thinking about how to share her story with her selected team members, knowing that their trust and effectiveness would depend on complete honesty about her background and motivations. Elena had chosen her team carefully from among the soldiers who had impressed her during various training exercises and previous assignments. Staff Sergeant Mike Chen brought tactical expertise and the kind of steady reliability that made him valuable in unpredictable situations. Lieutenant Sarah Morrison's intelligence background and cultural sensitivity would be crucial for working with civilian populations. Corporal David Kim's communication skills and technical expertise would ensure that the team could maintain contact with command and coordinate with other units as needed. Specialist Amanda Torres had been added for her medical training and her experience working with trauma victims. As the team members arrived and took their seats around the conference table, Elena felt the familiar mixture of anxiety and determination that preceded important moments in her military career. These were all experienced soldiers who had earned her respect through their professionalism and dedication, but none of them knew about the personal experiences that had shaped her approach to service and leadership. General Wellington entered the room at precisely the scheduled time, his presence immediately commanding attention from everyone present. Elena had briefed her team about the general's involvement in the Patterson assignment, but this was the first time most of them had been in the same room with an officer of his rank and reputation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Wellington began, his voice carrying easily through the room, "you've been selected for an assignment that combines traditional military security operations with humanitarian protection in environments where those two missions sometimes conflict with each other. Captain Rodriguez will be explaining the specific parameters of your deployment, but I want to emphasize from the beginning that this mission requires not just professional competence, but personal commitment to protecting people who have experienced trauma similar to what many of you may have encountered in your own lives." Elena felt Wellington's words setting the stage for her own presentation, and she appreciated his emphasis on the personal dimensions of the assignment. It would make her own revelations feel more natural and relevant rather than simply confessional. Wellington continued his introduction by explaining the strategic importance of the Patterson assignment within broader military and diplomatic objectives. The team would be deployed to regions where educational institutions had been targets of violence, providing security while also helping to rebuild trust between military personnel and civilian populations who had learned to view soldiers with suspicion and fear. The success of this mission, Wellington concluded, will depend on your ability to connect with people who have every reason to distrust military personnel, and to demonstrate through your actions that you understand something about the experiences that have shaped their fears and their hopes. As Wellington left the room, Elena stood and moved to the front of the conference table, feeling the weight of her team's attention and the magnitude of what she was about to share with them. She had practiced this presentation several times, but the reality of discussing her most personal experiences with fellow soldiers felt different from anything she had rehearsed. Our mission, Elena began, will take us to 3 different regions over the next 18 months. In each location, we'll be providing security for schools and educational facilities that have been targets of violence, while also working with local populations to rebuild trust in institutions that are supposed to protect rather than threaten children and teachers. Elena activated the wall display and showed maps of their deployment areas, pointing out the strategic challenges and cultural considerations that would affect their operations. She discussed the tactical aspects of providing security in urban environments where threats could come from multiple directions and where civilian safety had to be balanced against military effectiveness. But before we discuss tactics and logistics, Elena continued, I need to share something about my personal background that's directly relevant to this mission and to my qualifications for leading this team. The room became noticeably quieter as Elena's tone shifted from professional briefing to something more personal. Chen, Morrison, Kim, and Torres gave her their complete attention, sensing that what she was about to say would be significant for their understanding of the mission and their confidence in her leadership. Elena took a deep breath and began telling the story she had kept private for 7 years. She described her career as an elementary school teacher, her commitment to her students, and the morning when everything changed because of a gunman who entered her school with weapons and intentions that transformed her understanding of vulnerability and responsibility. I was in the hallway when the shooting started, Elena said, her voice remaining steady through years of practice at discussing these events without being overwhelmed by them. I heard the first shots and understood immediately what was happening, but I couldn't get back to my classroom because the gunman was positioned between me and my students. Elena described the 13 minutes that felt like hours, listening to gunfire and sirens while hiding in a supply closet and desperately trying to think of ways to reach her classroom or to summon help that would arrive in time to make a difference. She talked about the guilt and self-doubt that followed, the questioning of every decision she had made during those crucial minutes, and the grief that came from losing 12 students who had depended on her for protection and safety. Morrison's expression showed the kind of professional empathy that military personnel developed when dealing with traumatic experiences, while Chen nodded with understanding that suggested he recognized something familiar in Elena's description of crisis decision-making under impossible circumstances. Kim and Torres listened with the focused attention that indicated they understood the significance of what Elena was sharing and its relevance to their upcoming mission. After the funerals and the investigations and the therapy sessions that were supposed to help me process what had happened, Elena continued, I made 2 decisions that shaped everything that came after. First, I would join the military and dedicate my life to protecting people from the kind of violence that had taken my students. Second, I would honor their memory in a way that would remind me every day of the weight of responsibility and the price of failure. Elena paused, knowing that the next part of her story would surprise her team members and perhaps change their understanding of her as a person and as a leader. I got a tattoo that covers most of my back. It shows the names and dates of my 12 students, along with images that represent their individual personalities and dreams. It's not something I display or discuss casually, but it's part of who I am and why I approach military service the way I do. Torres was the first to speak, her voice quiet but clear. Captain, that explains a lot about your leadership style and your attention to detail when it comes to safety protocols. Elena felt grateful for Torres's response, which focused on professional implications rather than personal sympathy or curiosity about the tattoo itself. The experience taught me lessons that military training alone couldn't provide. I learned about the speed with which situations can deteriorate, the importance of preparation and contingency planning, and the reality that protection requires constant vigilance rather than just good intentions. Chen leaned forward slightly, his expression serious but supportive. Ma'am, does command know about your background and how it relates to this assignment? General Wellington specifically selected me for this mission because of my background, Elena replied. He believes that personal experience with school violence will help me connect with the people we're assigned to protect and understand the stakes involved in our success or failure. Elena spent the next hour discussing the specific ways that her teaching experience and her understanding of trauma would inform their tactical approach to the mission. She talked about the psychology of fear in educational environments, the challenges of rebuilding trust after traumatic events, and the delicate balance between providing security and avoiding the kind of heavy-handed presence that might make children and teachers feel trapped rather than protected. Morrison asked detailed questions about the cultural considerations they would face in their deployment areas, while Kim wanted to understand the communication protocols that would be necessary for coordinating with local authorities and civilian organizations. Torres focused on the medical and psychological support that would be available for trauma victims, both among the populations they would be protecting and within their own team if the mission triggered difficult personal responses. As the briefing continued, Elena noticed that her team's questions and comments reflected not just professional interest in the mission parameters, but personal investment in the success of operations that would honor the memory of her students while preventing similar tragedies for other children and teachers. She felt a growing confidence that she had chosen the right soldiers for this assignment, people who understood that military service sometimes required carrying personal motivations alongside professional obligations. There's one more aspect of this deployment that I want to discuss, Elena said as the formal briefing portion of their meeting concluded. Our success will depend on establishing trust with people who have learned to be suspicious of military personnel. That means we need to be prepared to share appropriate details about our own backgrounds and motivations when doing so might help build the connections necessary for effective protection. Elena looked around the table, meeting the eyes of each team member as she continued. I'm not asking anyone to reveal personal information they're not comfortable sharing, but I am asking everyone to consider how your own experiences might help you connect with the people we're assigned to protect. Chen was quiet for a moment before responding. Captain, I think all of us have reasons for choosing military service that go beyond career opportunities or adventure. If sharing those reasons helps us protect kids and teachers, then that's what we should do. Morrison nodded in agreement. I joined the military after my younger brother was killed in a bombing that targeted his school. I understand something about how violence can destroy the sense of safety that education requires. Elena felt a deep satisfaction as her team members began sharing their own motivations for service, creating the foundation of trust and understanding that would be crucial for their mission's success. Kim talked about growing up in a family that had fled violence in their home country, while Torres described her experience as a medic treating victims of attacks on civilian targets. As the team meeting concluded, Elena realized that what she had feared might be her greatest vulnerability as a leader had instead become the source of her team's greatest strength. Her willingness to be transparent about her personal motivations had encouraged similar openness from her team members, creating bonds of trust and shared purpose that would serve them well in the challenging months ahead. Walking back to her quarters after dismissing her team, Elena felt more confident about the upcoming deployment than she had since receiving the assignment. Her students' memory would be honored not just through her individual service, but through the collective commitment of soldiers who understood that protecting others sometimes required sharing the personal experiences that had taught them about the weight of responsibility and the price of failure. 6 months into the Patterson assignment, Elena stood in a classroom in the mountain region of a war-torn country, watching 12 children practice reading aloud while her team maintained security positions that had become as natural as breathing. The school had been rebuilt twice after attacks that targeted education as a symbol of hope and progress, but this time the protection was different. This time, the soldiers understood not just the tactical requirements of security, but the emotional and psychological needs of children and teachers who had learned to associate military presence with either salvation or additional danger. Elena's tattoo had become something she no longer hid from her team or from the people they protected. During their second week of deployment, a young teacher named Amira had noticed Elena unconsciously touching her back while discussing security protocols for the school's reopening. When Amira had asked about the gesture with the kind of directness that survivors often developed when dealing with others who might understand their experiences, Elena had chosen to show rather than describe what she carried on her skin. The revelation had transformed Elena's relationship with the local educators and community leaders who were working to restore normal life to their region. Amira, who had lost students during an attack on her previous school, had understood immediately that Elena's tattoo represented not just personal grief, but professional commitment to ensuring that other teachers would not face similar losses. Word had spread through the community that the American captain carried her students' names on her back, and that her presence was motivated by something deeper than military duty or career advancement. The children in Elena's current school had initially been frightened by the presence of soldiers, even soldiers who spoke their language and treated them with obvious respect and care. But Chen's gentle patience with nervous students, Morrison's ability to help teachers develop emergency procedures without creating an atmosphere of fear, Kim's skill at maintaining communication systems that helped parents feel connected to their children's safety, and Torres's medical expertise that addressed both physical and emotional trauma had gradually built trust that Elena had initially thought would take years to establish. Elena's own breakthrough with the children had come during a crisis that tested everything her team had trained for and planned. A group of armed men had approached the school during afternoon classes, their intentions unclear but their presence sufficient to trigger the security protocols that Elena's team had practiced until they became automatic responses to perceived threats. Elena had been in the main classroom when Kim's voice came through her earpiece with the alert that unauthorized personnel were approaching the school perimeter. The standard response would have been to initiate lockdown procedures and prepare for potential armed confrontation, but Elena found herself thinking not just like a soldier, but like a teacher who understood the psychological impact of fear on children who had already experienced more trauma than most adults could comprehend. Instead of ordering an immediate lockdown, Elena had calmly approached the children and used a signal that she had developed with their regular teacher to indicate that they should begin the quiet reading activity that had become their routine response to tense situations. The children had immediately understood that something was happening, but Elena's composed demeanor and familiar presence had prevented the kind of panic that could have made an already dangerous situation much worse. Elena moved to the window where she could assess the approaching men while remaining visible to the children, her hand resting naturally on her sidearm but her body language suggesting confidence rather than alarm. Through her earpiece, she coordinated with Chen and Morrison, who were positioned to intercept the men if their intentions proved hostile, while Torres prepared to evacuate children through the school's rear exit if evacuation became necessary. The crucial moment came when Elena realized that one of the approaching men was the father of two children in the classroom, a man who worked in a distant region but had returned to check on his family's safety after hearing rumors of increased military activity in the area. His presence with other men who were unknown to the school community had triggered security concerns, but his obvious emotional distress suggested confusion and worry rather than hostile intent. Elena made a decision that drew on both her military training and her understanding of family dynamics under stress. She asked the children's teacher to bring the man's two daughters to the window where their father could see them, while Elena maintained her position in a way that demonstrated protective awareness without suggesting immediate threat. The relief on the father's face when he saw his children safe and engaged in normal classroom activities transformed the entire situation from potential confrontation to family reunion. Chen and Morrison had been prepared for armed conflict, but Elena's ability to read the emotional dynamics of the situation had prevented violence that could have shattered the trust the team had worked months to build with the community. The father had become one of their strongest advocates, spreading word through his extended family and business connections that the American soldiers genuinely cared about protecting children rather than simply maintaining military control over the region. Incidents like this had taught Elena that her background as a teacher was not simply relevant to her military service, but essential for the success of missions that required understanding the human dynamics of protection and security. General Wellington had been right to select her for this assignment, but even he had not fully anticipated how her personal experience would translate into tactical advantages that no amount of standard military training could provide. Elena's team had also grown in ways that went beyond professional competence. Morrison had begun working with local teachers to develop trauma-informed educational practices that helped children process their experiences without being overwhelmed by them. Chen had established relationships with community leaders that provided intelligence about potential threats while also demonstrating respect for local autonomy and decision-making. Kim had created communication networks that connected schools with medical facilities, security forces, and family members in ways that increased safety without creating dependence on military presence. Torres had trained local medical personnel in techniques for treating both physical injuries and psychological trauma, creating capabilities that would remain after the military team completed their assignment. But the most significant development had been Elena's own understanding of how her students' memory could be honored through service that went beyond personal obligation to create lasting change in the lives of other children and teachers. The names on her back had become more than private remembrance. They had become inspiration for work that helped entire communities rebuild their relationship with education and learning. During one of her regular reports to General Wellington, Elena had described how her team's approach was creating results that exceeded their original mission parameters. Schools in their assigned region were not only reopening, but experiencing increased enrollment as parents began to trust that their children could attend classes without facing the dangers that had previously made education too risky to attempt. Wellington's response had surprised Elena with its emotional directness. "Captain Rodriguez, your students would be proud of what you've accomplished. Their deaths were tragedy, but your response to that tragedy has saved lives and created opportunities that will benefit children for generations." Elena had felt tears threatening for the second time since joining the military, but this time they were tears of satisfaction rather than grief. She was finally beginning to believe that her failure to protect her own students had been transformed into capability that helped her protect other people's children more effectively than she ever could have if she had not experienced loss and learned from it. The tattoo that had been her secret shame for 7 years had become a source of strength that connected her with people who understood something about carrying invisible scars and choosing to use painful experiences as motivation for service rather than allowing them to become sources of permanent bitterness or withdrawal from the world. As Elena's deployment neared its conclusion, the community had organized a ceremony to honor her team's service and to celebrate the reopening of schools throughout the region. Elena had been asked to speak at the ceremony, and she had chosen to talk about the ways that tragedy could become the foundation for hope when people committed themselves to protecting others from similar experiences. Standing before an audience of teachers, parents, students, and community leaders, Elena had shown the tattoo that covered her back for the first time in a public setting. She had explained how each name represented not just a life that had been lost, but a reminder of the responsibility that came with survival and the obligation to use knowledge gained through suffering to prevent similar suffering for others. The response had been immediate and profound. Teachers who had lost students in attacks on their schools came forward to share their own stories, parents talked about their fears and hopes for their children's education, and children themselves asked questions about how people could choose to help rather than hurt when faced with difficult circumstances. Elena realized that her tattoo had become more than personal memorial or professional qualification. It had become a bridge between her experience and the experiences of people who faced similar challenges in different cultural and geographical contexts. The universal nature of loss, fear, hope, and commitment to protecting others had created connections that transcended national boundaries and cultural differences. General Wellington attended the ceremony and used his remarks to announce that the Patterson assignment would be expanded to additional regions, with Elena's team serving as a model for other units that would combine traditional military security operations with the kind of personal understanding and cultural sensitivity that created lasting change rather than temporary solutions. As Elena prepared to return to Fort Henderson for new assignments and additional training, she felt that her career had finally found its true purpose. The students whose names she carried on her back had taught her about responsibility, failure, and the weight of protection. Her military service had taught her about discipline, strategy, and the skills necessary for effective action under pressure. The combination of these experiences had created capabilities that she could never have developed through either civilian or military experience alone. Walking through the school one final time before her departure, Elena touched each classroom doorway and thought about the children who would spend their days learning and growing in safety that her team had helped establish. She thought about her own students, whose deaths had seemed senseless and devastating 7 years ago, but whose memory had ultimately led to protection for hundreds of other children who would have opportunities that had been denied to the 12 whose names she would carry for the rest of her life. Elena's tattoo would always be a reminder of loss and failure, but it had also become proof that tragedy could be transformed into purpose when people chose service over despair and commitment to others over retreat into private grief. The uniform she wore over her tattooed skin represented not just her individual journey from teacher to soldier, but the possibility that personal experience and professional dedication could combine to create protection that honored both the dead and the living. As her transport prepared for departure, Elena looked back at the school where children were starting another day of classes in safety that had seemed impossible just months before. Her students' names would travel with her to new assignments and new challenges, but they would also remain in the relationships, systems, and sense of security that her team had helped establish in a place where education had once seemed too dangerous to attempt. The general had been stunned not by Elena's tattoo itself, but by what it represented and what it had enabled her to accomplish. Her back bore the story of failure transformed into service, of loss transformed into protection, and of personal trauma transformed into professional capability that could prevent similar tragedies for others. It was a story written in ink and skin, but lived out in classrooms and communities where children could learn and grow because someone had chosen to carry their grief in a way that honored the dead by protecting the living.